He never fired a shot in World War II, but his blueprints armed half the planet. In July 1944, while Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, a middle-aged economist sat in a New Hampshire hotel ballroom, designing the architecture of American financial dominance for the next 70 years. His name was Harry Dexter White, and by the time he died 4 years later, the FBI had labeled him a Soviet spy. So here's the question that's haunted historians ever since. Did the man who built the scaffolding of American economic power, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the post-war dollar system, secretly serve Moscow while doing it? And if he did, does that mean the global financial order we still live under today was shaped, at least in part, by Soviet intelligence? Let's unpack this, because the story is messier, stranger, and more tragic than any simple accusation of treason. Harry Dexter White was born in Boston in 1892, the seventh child of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who'd fled the Russian Empire. His father ran a hardware store. Harry worked there as a boy, then enlisted in the army during World War I, serving as a lieutenant in France. He didn't start college until he was 29. First at Columbia, then Stanford, finally Harvard, where he earned his PhD in economics at the age of 40. That's late. Most economists of his generation were already publishing, teaching, climbing academic ladders. White was just beginning. But in 1934, he caught a break. Jacob Viner, a prominent economist working at the U.S. Treasury, offered him a job analyzing the effects of Roosevelt's decision to raise the dollar price of gold. White accepted. Within a decade, he would become the most powerful economist in the American government. By 1941, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had promoted White to Assistant Secretary, the top economist role in the department. Morgenthau trusted him completely. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, Morgenthau told his staff, "I want it all in one brain, and I want it in Harry White's brain." White was now responsible for all wartime international finance. He had access to classified economic data on the United States and its allies. He knew dollar reserves, gold stocks, loan terms, strategic currency flows, the hidden arteries of the Allied war effort. And according to declassified Soviet intelligence cables, he was passing some of that information to Moscow. But here's where it gets complicated, because White wasn't a communist. He never joined the party. He didn't admire Soviet ideology. In his personal writings, he praised Keynesian economics, government intervention to stabilize markets and promote growth, not Marxist revolution. He believed in regulated capitalism, not the abolition of private property. What White did believe in, passionately, was preventing another world war. He'd watched the Treaty of Versailles punish Germany into economic collapse, which fed the rise of fascism. He'd seen the Great Depression destroy millions of lives because nations competed instead of cooperating. He was convinced that the only way to stop the cycle was to build a system where countries traded freely, where currencies were stable, where economic disputes didn't escalate into military ones. And he believed that system required the Soviet Union. In an unpublished manuscript White wrote in 1945, he argued, "No major war is possible unless the United States and the Soviet Union are on opposing sides. The major task that confronts American diplomacy is to devise means whereby friendship and military alliance can be assured between the United States and Russia." This wasn't treason, it was idealism. The same idealism that led many American officials during the war to believe the Grand Alliance could survive into peacetime. White wanted the Soviets inside the post-war financial system because he thought keeping them out would doom that system to failure. So when Soviet intelligence approached him, and they did repeatedly, White made a choice. He didn't see himself as a spy, he saw himself as a bridge. The evidence comes from three sources. First, Whittaker Chambers, a former Soviet courier who defected in 1939. Chambers told the FBI that White had passed him Treasury documents in the late 1930s. He described White as timid, someone who thought he was smarter than the communists and could use them, but really they used him. Second, Elizabeth Bentley, another Soviet courier, who testified in 1945 that White had provided classified information through intermediaries. Treasury officials named Nathan Silvermaster and Ludwig Ullman, both of whom were part of a Soviet espionage network. Third, the Venona Project. During the war, American cryptographers secretly intercepted and began decrypting Soviet intelligence cables. By 1950, they'd identified Harry Dexter White under the code names Jurist, Richard, and Lawyer. One decrypted cable from April 1944 reported that White had informed the Soviets about conversations between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Vice President Henry Wallace. Another noted that White was willing for any self-sacrifice on behalf of Soviet intelligence, but feared exposure might cause a political scandal and damage Roosevelt's re-election chances. The cables are real. The decryptions have been verified by the NSA. But here's what they don't tell us. Motive. Because White didn't do this for money. Soviet archives show he refused payment. He didn't do it for ideology. He wasn't a communist. And he didn't do it to harm the United States, because the policies he designed, the institutions he built, served American interests more effectively than anything else in modern history. So what was he doing? Let's talk about Bretton Woods. In July 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission? Design the post-war international financial system. The conference lasted 3 weeks. More than 700 diplomats, economists, and officials debated everything from exchange rates to loan terms to gold reserves. But the real architecture was being hammered out between two men. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, and Harry Dexter White, representing the United States. Keynes wanted a global central bank that would issue a new international currency called Bancor, a reserve unit backed by a basket of commodities, not tied to any single nation. Countries with trade surpluses would be penalized just as much as countries with deficits, forcing them to spend and rebalance. It was elegant, ambitious, and designed to prevent any one nation from dominating the system. White had a different vision. He proposed a fund, the International Monetary Fund, where each member country would deposit a quota of its own currency in gold. Countries facing balance of payments deficits could then borrow foreign exchange from the pool, but only temporarily, and only if they agreed to policy reforms. The system would be anchored to gold, yes, but practically speaking, it would be anchored to the dollar, because the United States held most of the world's gold reserves. Keynes called White's plan a monstrous monkey house. He wanted a small, elite conference between Britain and America to cook up a deal and present it to the others. White refused. He insisted on a multilateral negotiation where every allied nation had a voice. Not because he was a Democrat, but because he understood that the system would only work if everyone felt they had a stake in it. And White won. Nearly every major feature of the Bretton Woods system came from his plan: fixed but adjustable exchange rates, member quotas, policy conditions on IMF loans, capital controls as a backup option, the dollar as the de facto global reserve currency. Keynes was brilliant. Keynes was famous. Keynes was a legend. But White had the power, because Britain was bankrupt and America wasn't. Here's what that system meant in practice. After the war, the dollar became the currency everyone needed. Want to buy oil? Pay in dollars. Want to trade machinery? Pay in dollars. Want to hold foreign reserves? Hold dollars. And because the International Monetary Fund required gold and currency deposits from member countries, the United States effectively controlled the mechanism for stabilizing global finance. If a country ran into trouble, it came to Washington. If it wanted a loan, it accepted American terms. This wasn't colonialism, it was something subtler, a financial architecture that made American preferences the default setting for the global economy. White understood exactly what he was building. In his drafts, he wrote that the purpose of the IMF was to promote sustained prosperity. But he also knew that prosperity required American leadership, American capital, and American access to foreign markets. So was this imperialism? Not exactly, because White genuinely believed that American dominance was good for everyone. He thought a stable, dollar-based system would prevent the economic chaos that bred fascism. He thought opening trade would lift living standards worldwide. He thought tying the world to American finance would make war less likely. And for 30 years, he was mostly right. The Bretton Woods system stabilized Europe, financed reconstruction, and enabled the longest period of global economic growth in modern history. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank became the twin pillars of post-war development. The dollar became the universal language of trade. But here's the twist. While White was designing this system, he was also sharing details of American economic strategy with Soviet intelligence. Why? The best explanation is this. White wanted the Soviets inside the tent. He knew that if the Soviet Union stayed outside the Bretton Woods system, the post-war order would fracture into rival blocs. Capitalist West versus Communist East, economic competition sliding into military confrontation. He'd seen that movie before. It ended in World War. So White tried to thread the needle. He built a system that served American interests, yes, but he also worked behind the scenes to reassure Moscow that they wouldn't be shut out. In November 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, White drafted a proposal for a comprehensive peaceful solution between the United States and Japan. The State Department rewrote it completely. White's version was never presented to Tokyo. Some historians now argue that White manipulated that process to delay negotiations, ensuring Japan would attack, which would benefit Stalin by keeping Japan from invading the Soviet Far East. The evidence is circumstantial, but it fits a pattern. White also obstructed a proposed $200 million loan to nationalist China in 1943, at a time when Chinese inflation was spiraling and Chiang Kai-shek's government desperately needed support. The loan was officially approved. White sat on it. Some historians believe White delayed it deliberately to weaken Chiang and strengthen Mao's communists. And then there's the currency plates. In 1944, as Allied forces prepared to occupy Germany, the U.S. Treasury had to decide how to print money for the occupation zones. The solution? Create printing plates for Allied military marks, temporary currency that soldiers and administrators could use. The Americans made plates, the British made plates, and over objections from some officials, the Soviets were given plates too. The result? The Soviets printed unlimited amounts of occupation currency, flooding the black market, sparking massive inflation, and costing the U.S. government an estimated $250 million. Elizabeth Bentley later testified that White had arranged for the plates to be delivered to the Soviets on orders from Soviet intelligence. A memorandum found in Soviet archives in the 1990s confirms that White, through intermediaries, pushed the Treasury to approve the transfer. So did White knowingly hand Moscow a tool to destabilize the German economy? Or did he simply believe that denying the Soviets access to the plates would poison post-war cooperation? Treasury officials at the time feared the latter. They thought refusing the plates would signal distrust, wreck the alliance, and make governance of occupied Germany impossible. White may have agreed, but Soviet intelligence certainly took advantage. By 1945, the war was over. The Bretton Woods institutions were being set up. White was named the first U.S. executive director of the International Monetary Fund, and the FBI was watching him. On November 8, 1945, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sent a hand-delivered letter to President Truman's military aide. It listed a dozen individuals suspected of passing information to Soviet intelligence. Harry Dexter White was second on the list. 6 weeks later, on January 23, 1946, Truman nominated White to head the IMF anyway. Why? Truman later claimed he removed White from government promptly upon learning of the allegations. But that's not true. White stayed at the IMF for another year and a half, until June 1947, when he abruptly resigned, the same day that Attorney General Tom Clark ordered a federal grand jury to investigate Elizabeth Bentley's accusations. The most likely explanation is that Truman didn't believe the charges. Chambers and Bentley were defectors with murky motives. The Venona decrypts were still classified. Truman himself may never have been told about them. And White's public record was spotless. He designed the financial architecture that made America the dominant economic power on the planet. He'd helped win the war. He'd built institutions that would shape global development for generations. How could that man be a traitor? In August 1948, White was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He denied everything. "I am not now and never have been a communist," he told the committee. "I have never been a member of any communist organization. I have never knowingly associated with communists." It was technically true. White had never joined the party, but he'd passed classified documents to people he knew were Soviet agents. He'd influenced policy in ways that benefited Moscow, and he'd done it while holding one of the most sensitive positions in the U.S. government. 2 days after his testimony, White had a heart attack. He retreated to his farm in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire to recover. He had another heart attack almost immediately. On August 16, 1948, Harry Dexter White died. He was 55 years old. The allegations followed him into death. Senator Joseph McCarthy used White's case as Exhibit A in his crusade against communist infiltration. FBI files on White were leaked, declassified, analyzed, weaponized. And the Venona decrypts, when they were finally made public in the 1990s, seemed to confirm the worst. White had been a Soviet source, codenamed jurist, but even now historians can't agree on what that means. Here's what we know for certain. White passed classified information to Soviet intelligence. He did it knowingly. He did it repeatedly. By any modern legal standard, that's espionage. But White didn't act like a spy. He didn't use dead drops in invisible ink, coded messages. He didn't cover his tracks. He worked openly with Soviet officials as part of his treasury duties, and he used those relationships to pass information he thought would serve a larger goal, keeping the Grand Alliance alive. Robert Skidelsky, one of Keynes's biographers, concluded in 2000, "There is no question of treachery in the accepted sense of betraying one's country's secrets to an enemy, but there can be no doubt that in passing classified information to the Soviets, White knew he was betraying his trust, even if he did not thereby think he was betraying his country." That paradox is the key. White believed the Soviet Union had to be inside the post-war system, or the system would fail. He believed transparency with Moscow would prevent misunderstandings that could lead to war, and he believed he could control the flow of information, that he was using Soviet intelligence, not the other way around. He was wrong about that last part. Soviet handlers knew exactly what they were doing. They cultivated White, flattered him, used him. They changed his code name repeatedly to protect their source. And when White became too visible, too risky, they backed off. White thought he was playing chess. He was being played. So what's his legacy? The institutions White designed, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system, survived him by decades. The fixed exchange rate regime collapsed in 1971 when President Nixon took the dollar off gold. But the IMF endured. The World Bank endured. The dollar's dominance endured. And the financial architecture White built still shapes the global economy today. When a country faces a debt crisis, it goes to the IMF. When developing nations need infrastructure loans, they go to the World Bank. When central banks hold reserves, they hold dollars. The system isn't perfect. Critics on the left call it neo-colonial. Critics on the right call it bureaucratic overreach. But it's still the system. White never got credit for it during his lifetime. Keynes was the celebrity. White was the bureaucrat in the shadows. And after his death, the espionage allegations buried his reputation entirely. But here's the irony. If White had been a committed Soviet agent, if he'd actually tried to sabotage American interests, he would have designed a different system. He would have weakened the dollar, sabotaged the IMF, undermined European recovery. Instead, he built the most effective instrument of American economic power in history. So maybe the real question isn't whether White was loyal. Maybe it's whether loyalty is even the right frame. Because White lived in a moment when the lines were blurry. The Soviet Union wasn't yet the Cold War enemy. It was an ally, bleeding millions to defeat Hitler. Sharing information with Moscow wasn't obviously treason when Soviet and American soldiers were fighting side by side. And the belief that the Grand Alliance could survive, that the post-war world could avoid splitting into rival blocs, that wasn't naive in 1944. It was a reasonable hope. White's tragedy is that he kept hoping after the hope was gone. He kept believing cooperation was possible even as Stalin tightened control over Eastern Europe. He kept thinking he could manage the relationship even as Soviet intelligence manipulated him. He kept trying to thread the needle between American interests and Soviet inclusion. And in the end, he served both and betrayed both. The 1997 Moynihan Commission on Government Secrecy concluded, "The complicity of Alger Hiss of the State Department seems settled, as does that of Harry Dexter White of the Treasury Department." But even Moynihan's report acknowledged the ambiguity. Because White's actions didn't fit the profile of a traitor, He didn't sell secrets for money. He didn't sabotage American policy. He didn't admire communism. What he did was gamble that he could serve two masters, American power and Soviet cooperation, and that the gamble would pay off in a more peaceful world. He lost that bet, but the empire he built still stands. In 1948, just months before his death, White drafted a proposal to dramatically increase the IMF's resources. He designed the IMF based on 1930s trade volumes and Depression-era assumptions. He'd imagined a world slowly recovering, where modest loans could stabilize temporary imbalances. Instead, the global economy exploded. Marshall Plan aid flooded Europe. Trade expanded faster than anyone predicted. White saw this coming. Even as his health failed, even as the FBI investigation closed in, he was working on a solution. An international reserve asset that would supplement gold and dollars, expanding the system's capacity without requiring massive new deposits from member states. He called them trade dollars. The idea went nowhere in 1948. White died. The proposal was filed away. But 20 years later, in 1969, the IMF created exactly what White had envisioned: special drawing rights, or SDRS, an international reserve asset that countries could use to supplement their reserves. Today, SDRs are a cornerstone of IMF crisis response. During the 2008 financial crisis, the fund issued $250 billion worth. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it issued $650 billion more. White never lived to see it, but he'd sketched the blueprint while dying. And here's the darkest irony of all. White's espionage may have actually strengthened the very system he was supposedly betraying, because every piece of intelligence White passed to Moscow revealed American economic thinking, American priorities, American vulnerabilities. The Soviets learned what mattered to Washington. They learned how the dollar system worked. They learned the mechanics of American financial power, and that knowledge terrified them. Soviet economists, reading White's reports, understood that the Bretton Woods system wasn't just about currency stability. It was about creating a world where economic integration made Soviet isolation inevitable, where countries that wanted to trade, to grow, to modernize, would have to align with American institutions. Stalin saw the trap. That's why he refused to join. But refusing to join didn't save the Soviet Union. It just meant they spent the next 45 years outside the most dynamic economic system in human history, watching their satellites get pulled into Western orbit one loan at a time. White gave Moscow the intelligence. Moscow used it to opt out, and opting out doomed them. So in the end, White's espionage didn't weaken American power. It revealed it so clearly that the Soviets felt they had no choice but to resist. And resistance in this case meant economic stagnation, technological decline, and eventual collapse. White thought he was helping both sides. He helped neither. Today, when the International Monetary Fund imposes austerity measures on struggling economies, when the World Bank finances development projects in the Global South, when central banks intervene to stabilize currency markets, they're using tools Harry Dexter White designed. When critics accuse the IMF of serving American interests at the expense of poorer nations, they're not wrong. That's what White built it to do, not through malice but through architecture. A system where American preferences became the default, where borrowing required accepting American terms, where financial stability meant aligning with American power. His daughters spent the rest of their lives defending him. In 2012, one of them wrote to the New York Times, "Old allegations of espionage against my father are once again repeated as fact." She wasn't wrong to protest. The evidence is real, but it's not simple. White passed information. He broke his trust. But he also believed he was serving a higher loyalty, not to Moscow, not to Washington, but to a post-war order that would make another world war impossible. He failed at that. But the system he built, the institutions he designed, the financial architecture he imposed, those succeeded beyond anything he imagined. So here's the final question. If a man builds an empire while secretly serving its rival, and the empire endures while the rival collapses, was he a traitor? Or was he just the most successful American imperialist who never meant to be one? White wasn't loyal to America or to Russia. He was loyal to a vision, a world where institutions prevent war, where economic integration makes conflict too expensive, where architecture replaces armies. He was right about the institutions. They did prevent another world war. They did create the longest period of economic growth in human history, but he was wrong about the cost, because the system he built to prevent war became a weapon itself. Not a gun, not a bomb, but a structure that enforced a particular kind of peace. American peace, on American terms, for American benefit. White wanted to prevent empire. He built the most successful empire in history. He wanted to include the Soviets. He created the conditions for their exclusion. He wanted peace through cooperation. He achieved peace through domination. He succeeded at everything he tried to do, and failed at everything he hoped to accomplish. That's not a cautionary tale. That's tragedy. Harry Dexter White died believing he'd failed. He'd been exposed, his reputation destroyed, his dream of Soviet-American cooperation dead, his health broken by stress and accusation. He died never knowing that his failure would become the foundation of American dominance for the next century, that his institutions would outlive the Soviet Union by decades, that his architecture would prove more durable than any ideology, any alliance, any superpower. He died thinking he'd built a bridge. He'd actually built an empire, and because he built it to look like a bridge, nobody recognized it for what it was until it was too late to dismantle. So the next time you hear about the IMF, or see dollar reserves shift, or watch the global financial system absorb another crisis, remember Harry Dexter White, the man who never wore a uniform, who carried a pen, who moved between Washington and Moscow thinking he could serve both, who built an empire while spying for its rival, who died in disgrace and left behind the most successful instrument of American power in history. The man who proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one everyone sees. It's the one nobody recognizes as a weapon at all. Until 75 years later, when you realize you've been living inside it your entire life, and it's too late to imagine any other world. The pen was never a weapon, it was a blueprint, and blueprints last longer than bullets.